Welcome to the sixth round. I'm your host, Navid Razi, from our MMA Weighin studios in downtown Dallas, alongside award-winning journalist for MMA Junkie and USA Today, John Morgan, from the fight capital of the world in Las Vegas, Nevada. And John, UFC 158 is in the books, where George St. Pierre unanimously defeated Nick Diaz. And there's a story that came out of Saturday night that's been bothering me a little bit. I usually agree with probably 90% of what Dana White says, because Dana White tends to keep it real, John. But just because Dana White says something doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to run over there and jump on board and agree with everything he said. And Dana said something along the lines that Cesar Gracie isn't the best manager for Nick Diaz. And obviously some of this is stemming from what Nick Diaz said about not ever paying taxes. But what's being portrayed in the public, John, as opposed to what's happening behind the scenes, there's a much more happening behind the scenes why Dana White doesn't want to deal with Cesar Gracie. It's difficult enough to deal with Nick Diaz as it is. To add to the fact, Cesar Gracie is over there tweeting that Nick Diaz shouldn't be getting first-class tickets, and Nick Diaz didn't miss the countdown, and the UFC is overpaying their cameraman if they're really paying $50,000 for production and filming. And I will give you, John, that Cesar Gracie, in my mind, from the one psychology class that I had to retake, is definitely an enabler. But it's similar to when you see a parent and a horribly spoiled child that's beating up other kids and taking their toys, and the parents shrugging their shoulders and defending their kid to a T and saying, you know, they've done nothing wrong, instead of forcing them to take responsibility. I'll concede that, John, but Cesar Gracie is an enabler. But at some point, Nick Diaz has to man up and say, you know what, man, I'm 30 years old. I'm 29. I'm about to turn 30. He's not a child who needs to be babysat and be led to attend press conferences. And the world is not out to get Nick Diaz. He needs to be held accountable. Nobody is buying this shtick that he didn't know when the press conference was. The entire world knows when these press conferences are, months in advance.
Yeah, you know, hey, listen, I'll give you a little bit of credit there. I mean, anytime Dana White says something, you got to understand that, yeah, of course, he's kind of looking out for number one. You know what I mean? He's looking out for the UFC's best interest and his best interest. But I will say this. I think there's something to it. You know, you're right. Nick Diaz probably should grow up a little bit and play the game a little bit like Dana White says. But that's what the manager is there to do. I mean, the manager is supposed to be that safety net, right, to ensure that all these things get done when the fighter's not living up to what they're supposed to do. And I think Cesar Gracie is dropping the ball there. But, you know, Cesar Gracie has a difficult job. Nick Diaz is a complicated individual. It's not easy to manage a guy like Nick Diaz, and I'll give him credit for that. I believe that. That said, Cesar Gracie is also his trainer. He's not just a business partner. He's not just a manager. And one of Nick Diaz's chief issues was he said he didn't have the right training partners for this training camp. I don't get that. So I think there is something to be said. You know, whether you think Cesar Gracie's an enabler, whether you think he's not good at his job, I don't know. I'll let you know, other people make that decision. But I would like to see kind of a fresh start for Nick Diaz. His last two fights, he hasn't looked particularly fantastic in. There didn't really seem to be a plan B. He got frustrated and said GSP must know his game plan. We all know your game plan, Nick. We know what you're going to do. So I would like to see a fresh start. I hope Nick Diaz doesn't retire. I know he said he'd do it in the cage, but he said that before. Sounds like he may have some sizable IRS checks to make things anyway, so he may need those purses anyway. I hope he doesn't retire. And here's what I said. I'd like to see a fresh start for Nick Diaz. Go to another camp, get you some new training partners, and let's book a fight with Rory McDonald. There's some history. He beat up your brother. You get a little bit of revenge there. Plus, you get to go against that Faraz Sahabi camp that you don't like. That's in a little way picking at George St. Pierre. That's the fight I want to see happen, but I want to see Nick Diaz get a fresh start. If Cesar Gracie wants to stay as manager and keep handling all that stuff behind the scenes, then so be it. I'm okay with it. But I think there's an issue with his training, and I want to see something change.
Yeah, that much I can agree with, John. If there's an issue with the actual training, then I can understand that, because he really hasn't looked too sharp in his last few fights, as you've mentioned. But I think to some extent Nick Diaz needs to be accountable, grow up a little bit, take responsibility, and drop this whole act that the whole world's out to get him and everybody's against him. As you mentioned, I don't think there's any chance that he's going to retire, because he's probably going to have to sign over that entire enormous check that he got from that GSP pay-per-view directly to the IRS. But I'm with you. Maybe it is good for him to change camps and switch things up a little bit. It remains to be seen what's going to happen, but that's going to do it for the sixth round. For Navid Razi in downtown Dallas, John Morgan in Las Vegas, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week.